Hello, everybody, and welcome back to AP Euro. This slidecast is to help introduce you to our second unit of the year, which is on the Renaissance. Now, this unit is on the AP test. It's the official start to the AP Euro curriculum. This unit is honestly probably one of my very favorite units. I wrote my master's thesis, which was approximately 145 pages, I believe, if I can remember correctly, on the Renaissance. It has a real special place in my heart. When I went overseas for the first time, the first place I went to was Florence, Italy, which is the birthplace of the Renaissance. And I remember walking around there and getting super inspired, thinking, I am looking what inspired Dante Alighieri, the writer of the Divine Comedy, or Michelangelo, famous sculptor and painter, a real true Renaissance man, which we'll go into in a minute. Some of the major topics in this unit really go about the whole or surround the whole topic of Renaissance itself. Renaissance means rebirth. And truly, during this time period, there was a rebirth in almost every aspect of society. Creatively, in terms of the arts and literature, intellectually, in terms of education and knowledge base and emphasis for learning, as well as philosophically. Technologically, new innovations, and scientifically, you saw the birth of the scientific revolution during this period. It actually was at the same time. This wouldn't have happened without a tremendous economic growth. That's what spawned it. You can't have the arts unless artists or people who are inspired by art have the financial backing, for example, to do it. So that really kind of started the whole Renaissance, and we talked a little bit about that with our medieval, how was the economy going to change as a result of the late Middle Ages. That's what bore us into this Renaissance period. Also, new political changes. No longer was every single thing wrapped around the Pope because there were cracks in the Catholic Church at the time. So we're going to examine all of those topics. But furthermore, we're also going to see how it spread from the Italian peninsula to the rest of Europe, why it spread, and the differences between what is termed the Italian Renaissance and the Northern European Renaissance. So let's look at some of the big pictures for these little mini topics. Intellectually, there were three hallmarks of the Renaissance period. The first and the most important is humanism. Now, humanism, there's two different types of humanism during this period. There was the Italian traditional Renaissance humanism, and there's also Northern humanism, which I'm going to discuss in a later slide. So, per Italian, humanism has several definitions. Predominantly, it is becoming the best human you can be intellectually, basically meaning study everything. It is from the concepts of humanism where you start to study humanity and you start to study a whole bunch of different types of educational areas. So you had the study of rhetoric, which means speech, and grammar, and poetry, and the maths, and sciences. You also started to study history. This was very different than the way education had been previously. Previously, education was mainly the concept of scholasticism, which is more emphasized in the religious aspects of it. It is a throwback to the ancient Greek and Latin ideas of philosophy and being an educated human. And in fact, that the study of the classics was a big element of humanism, the revival of antiquity. That's why a lot of people call the medieval ages the Dark Ages, because during the ancient times there was great intellectual growth and philosophy, and the Dark Ages, they kind of just shut off and they really began focusing on religion, and that's about it. I mean, there was some other stuff, but that was the predominant mindset. But the Renaissance stopped that. Now, it didn't stop it completely. The Catholic Church was still in the Italian peninsula the dominant political faction, but now you started to learn about other things, and you started to see colleges open up on the liberal arts. Most of you will probably, who are watching this, will probably go to a liberal arts college, and it just means that you're taking courses in different areas, not just focusing on one, and that's humanism. Now, I have two names on the slide afterwards, underneath the humanism bullet point. One is Petrarch. Francesco Petrarca, also known as Petrarch, is known as the father of humanism, and it's his picture on the bottom left, bottom right, of this slide. He was from the Italian peninsula. He's the one who kind of came up with these ideas. Erasmus, Desidero Erasmus, who's not on the slide, was the head of, or kind of brought about humanism in Northern Europe, which was tweaked a little bit. And so he was known as the Prince of Humanism. I like to remember it by thinking in terms of patriarch, which means father, just so you can kind of remember it. But, you know, humanism is becoming a better person, trying to perfect humanity, trying to perfect knowledge by learning more. The other two intellectual hallmarks are new to this era, but probably not new to you. There's individualism. Individualism is trying to be the best you can be. So in this case, it's if you have a particular talent or ability in an area, dedicate yourself to it. Focus on it. Instead of always thinking about the greater good, maybe, think about what you need to do to be the best you can be. It used to be that people would be blacksmiths or whatever field they were in, and they just did whatever their father was. And again, individualism would allow these people to say, take a step back and say, you know what, I really like to draw, so I'm going to try to perfect my craft. Secularism is a separation of the church and material wealth, or material goods. Instead of everything being surrounded by the church, your whole life being about that, it's allowing somebody or allowing yourself to try to make a better life for yourself, make money, do things that aren't related to the church. Now, one thing I want to take point before I go on to the next slide is that individualism and secularism and humanism aren't separate entities all the time. You can be a humanist individualist and a secularist. You can be any combination of the three. So that's the big picture for the intellectual changes, and you're going to be reading a lot more about this as we go on. In terms of the political and economic changes, we saw the rise of temporal power during the Renaissance, during most areas of Europe. Ferdinand and Isabella are pictured below, and they're two great examples of these new style monarchs. You also saw an increase of a new type of business, the banking industry, and people becoming very wealthy as a result of it. Very famously, the Renaissance, as I said, started in Florence because the political family in charge of Florence, and that was the Medici family, got their money from banking. They actually became the bankers of the papacy, and they had so much wealth that they began to use that wealth to do things such as beautify their city with new art techniques and new art pieces. And that really allowed for more wealth among people, the banking industry, rather than just the wealth of institutions such as the church, which had been the case previously. Um, Feudalism began to fade in many of the areas in Western Europe. Now, it is still alive and well in Eastern Europe, and there at this point, and there were still parts of Western Europe that had feudalism, but you did see a change in with the rise of the individual and the fact that people could make more money and make money on their own. These are some of the big picture items of how politics and economics and the changes within them exemplified the Renaissance period. Most famously, most people, when they think of the Renaissance, they think of the arts. I'm a huge fan of art, and Renaissance art, as well as Renaissance literature, are some of my favorite. We'll be going into the details of these in a great more depth, but some of the new innovations in art were oil paints used for the first time, using perspective to show depth of new subject matter. Sure, you still had religious subjects, but now you have a lot more portraits of people. Because of the emphasis on humanism, some of the classics were depicted, and myths were depicted in artistry. You also had a real elevated stature of artists. Artists were seen as icons. The public, the wealthy people, including the papacy, would pay for these artists to perfect their art, a little bit of individualism, and to create specific items for their homes or their towns or their churches, buildings, whatever. So there was a really huge level of respect for the arts, and we saw amazing growth at that time, which we will go into later on. In literature, there was a lot of more people reading and writing. There also were a lot more types of writing taking place, new genres. So, for example, the first autobiography was written at this time. The first how-to manual was written at this time. Political theories were written at this time. The first history book, The History of Florence, was written at this time, and they did so because people were reading more, and they weren't just reading the Bible, and also because of a new innovation, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So as you can see, and as you probably already know, the Renaissance is epitomized by the growth in the creative arts. As I just said, and I'm just going to, even though this is a little out of order on the slide, tell you another reason why literature grew so much at this time. During the Renaissance, movable type and the printing press were innovated and really made very modern and able to spread ideas and allow more people to read the same thing rather than people writing things out in longhand, which you can imagine taking forever. You also, as I mentioned earlier, have the birth of scientific revolution, which is a different unit, but the thing about the first couple units in here, they're at the same time. So in addition, I don't even have it here, the new innovations and exploring tools are also a part of the Renaissance because exploration happened at this time, the Reformation happened at the same time, and the scientific revolution happened at the same time. They're all kind of tied together, but because it is a lot of information, the textbook and teachers teach them separately just for clarity. So how did all of these ideas spread? We know they started in the Italian peninsula, They spread partially because of the printing press. The printing press spread ideas. They also spread because with the birth of the new colleges that I mentioned when we talked about humanism, um, that that promoted the new ideas being taught. Another way is that the artists wanted to learn learn from other artists, and they traveled a lot. For example, Leonardo da Vinci spent much of his time in Paris for the king at the time, King Francis, and he learned from the local artists there. Leonardo da Vinci is often credited for inventing oil paints, and he actually didn't. It was from the north. One of the first painters who used oil paints was Jan van Eyck from Flanders, one of my favorite painters, probably my favorite painter actually of all time. And he got the ideas from there and brought it back with him to Italy. The same in reverse. A lot of the northern painters went to the Italian peninsula, and with all that, they were able to share ideas. Now, the northern humanism and the Northern Renaissance was very different than the Italian Renaissance, in that there was a big emphasis on the church. The Northern Renaissance was much more religious, and the concept was, instead of improving with Northern humanism, instead of improving humanity, it was kind of like, let's improve the church. Obviously, there were issues in the church, they felt, and they were very heavily involved in the Protestant Reformation at the same time. So let's apply the ideas of the Italian humanism, but use that for the church. And if we improve the church, not move away from the church, but just fix the church, then everything else will kind of fall into place afterwards. It was the Northern Renaissance was very much more religious. It was also much more about the common man. I mentioned how wealthy people in the Italian peninsula would be the patrons of art, for example, and the subjects of art in portraits. In the north, which started about 100 years later, it was a little bit different. And we're going to go into that in a lot more detail when we talk about the arts itself. But the northern area, because they were more focused on religion, they were also more focused on the common man and helping those people who struggled a little bit more economically. This is a good stopping point, and this is obviously a graphic organizer, kind of explaining the big ideas of the Renaissance period. So feel free to pause it and look in a little bit more detail here. But if you can think of those things and just keep remembering that the Renaissance was a rebirth, I think you're going to fall in love with this subject as much as I love it. Thank you. Have a great day.